Hello, this is Ms. Howell, and I would like to walk you through. Maybe you're thinking, I'd love to do a speech, but I don't know what to do about which category. So I'd like to walk you through each of these categories. I'll give you a brief overview of what each category is, and I'll give you a few examples from when my family did it. Um, I'll walk you through the storyline to hopefully give you an idea of what would work for this category. Um, I don't have all of the authors. I will give the titles, and although I don't have the authors, I'll try to give you the sources at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. With religious reading, a lot of times it may get confused with dramatic interpretation. Um, I think part of that is because it both tend to be very dramatic, but the religious reading is overt religious things spoken throughout the speech. Dramatic interpretation is more of God isn't necessarily mentioned, and although religious activities may be mentioned, it's not the overarching theme of the speech. So examples that I can give would be the Second Mile, which is the story of a Jewish boy who learns the significance of going the extra mile when he recalls something that he heard Jesus say. And Ho-Yeon's Bowl of Rice, which is the story about a young boy who grew up shortly uh, around the time of the Chinese communist takeover, and he learns the significance of if thine enemy hunger, feed him. And so you can see where that would play throughout the whole speech. With oral interpretation of scripture, you're memorizing a scripture passage and presenting it from memory. And I would recommend a passage that gives a story. You don't have to have one, but I do recommend it because that gives you the opportunity to show off, demonstrating multiple characters and just the uniqueness that that creates, where a solid passage of scripture like a psalm may not necessarily do that. And so examples that I can give would be Esther chapters 5 through 7, where Esther is pleading for her life and for the life of her people. 2 Kings chapter 1 through chapter 2 and verse 14, where it marks the end of Elijah's ministry and the beginning of Elisha's ministry, and the book of Jonah. And I hope you know that storyline. With oral interpretation of poetry, there are two different styles of poetry that you could do for competition. The first one is the humorous poems, like Dr. Seuss, with all of his made up words and um, just all of that humor. And sometimes humorous poems do relatively well. But you also have the other side of poems, which are the more serious poems, like The Revenge, A Ballad of the Fleet. And this is the narrative of one ship that went up against the entire Spanish Armada shortly before the Armada was destroyed. And just the heroic of these men that knew we may not come out of this alive. In fact, we probably won't, but we're going to try anyway. With dramatic interpretation, this is the climax of a speech that has an unexpected turn of events. And I do recommend a climax with that. So the examples I could give would be The Renegade Husky, which is the story of this dog that this boy really likes, but the owner that the dog has is very, very mean. And if the dog stays with the owner will kill the dog. And so the boy is trying to figure out, is there a way where he can bargain with the owner to save the dog? The Wind is Free is about a Czech girl who grows up and is doesn't understand that she's part of the underground, but this speech kind of outlines how she figures out her role in the underground during World War II. Gold Mounted Guns is the story of a boy who wants to be an outlaw. And the person he chooses as his model, he comes to find out that that person is not who he says or who the boy thought he was. With oral persuasive oratory, you are creating your own speech and presenting it. I know when my oldest sister did it, she did topics like driving and energy drinks. And so you might choose a topic and say, hey, this is very interesting to me. I'm going to write a speech about it, and try to convince your audience that what you say is true and that something that they should consider. The more research you do with a topic like this, the better it will be. But remember that the rule book says that you can only use quotations for 10% of your speech. So that's a very small portion of your speech. So I would be very careful with finding common knowledge, because that common knowledge doesn't have to be quoted or cited, rather. And so just do your research and make it sound convincing. With extemporaneous speaking, you're given 3 topics, and then for 30 minutes, you're allowed to come up with what are my main points that I want to talk about. And then as soon as the 30 minutes are up, you present that speech in a different room. And so topics vary, but according to the rulebook, all of the topics come from World and Time magazines from the January to the March edition. So as you're planning for the school year, maybe some interesting things pop up in the news. Make mental note of it, and you can almost kind of plan, if you have time to do that, how would I give a speech about this? Because it has to go about, if you're junior high, I think it's like, I don't know the times. But anyway, look up the times because it is specific, and it varies based on if you're junior high or high school. So watch the time and practice giving extemporaneous speeches on different topics. With humorous interpretation, this is your opportunity to try to make the audience laugh. And so examples that I could give would be Peas by Beverly Cleary, which is the story of Ramona Quimby and how much she hates peas, but how they keep popping up in her realm of life. And then Anna and I Go Shopping, I think it was depicting life in, probably the late 1800s. And so these 2 little girls are going shopping for their relatives and keep forgetting certain items that have been requested. With declamation, you are presenting someone else's speech in the way that they would have presented it. So the example that I can give would be Margaret Thatcher's eulogy of Ronald Reagan. So I tried to give it in the tone that she would have presented that speech. I will say I did not use a British accent, but the idea is give it in the tone that they would have given it in. And then, in conclusion, a lot of the sources of the speeches we got were Rebecca 4th through 6th grade readers, and since they've redone either they're in the process of revising all of those readers, it might be a lot of new content that you could use for a speech. So I highly recommend, if you have access to those books, looking for speeches that you could use. I know we also used the Bob Jones 8th grade literature book. That's where we found speeches like Gold Mounted Guns and a few others. Obviously, Margaret Thatcher's eulogy we found online. There was one book that we found that was author unknown, but it was called The Martyrs of the Catacomb, and it's a really fascinating story how that book actually survived to where we have copies of it today. But it has a very powerful storyline, and so I would recommend looking up that book if you have the time to. Another thing I would say is be very careful with the morals you present in your story. Does good overcome evil? Are the characters changing for good, or are they changing for the worse? And I would be very careful of how you present that, how you present your speech and what you are actually presenting. And so I would strongly recommend, think through, is this really something I want to perform? And, in some cases, people will think of me by what I present. And so I would be very careful. Sometimes people don't mean to do it, but it can, and it sometimes does happen where if you present a speech, people associate you with the characters you present. So I would be very careful with who you are actually presenting. And I think that was all I was going to say. I hope this was helpful as you prepare for competition.